Some people walk into a room and you just know, they're not there to ask. They're there to remind the world of something it forgot. On an ordinary morning in Modesto, California, the fluorescent lights buzzed quietly inside Hamilton First Bank. Phones rang, fingers tapped on keyboards, and business moved as usual. Then she entered, not in a tailored suit, not with a lawyer by her side, but a small, elderly black woman wearing a faded blue dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat. The kind you might find in an old Sears catalog. On her shoulder, a time-worn canvas sack, stitched with the initials OBJ. She stepped into the center of the lobby, lifted her chin, and calmly said, "I'd like access to my office." At first, they laughed. A teller smirked. Someone cleared their throat to hide a chuckle. But then she opened the sack, and everything changed. Out came brittle papers, faded photographs, embossed documents, and a signature still legible after decades. E. H. Hamilton. The room fell silent. That day, she didn't bring demands, she brought receipts. Her quiet voice carried the weight of history, the pain of erasure, and the dignity of a legacy long denied. She wasn't there for revenge. She came to reclaim what was lost, not just for her family, but for every forgotten name that once built something real, only to be erased in silence. What followed wasn't just a legal battle, it was the return of a story to its rightful place. She didn't walk in like a protester. She didn't raise her voice, carry a sign, or demand to be heard. Instead, she walked into that bank the way someone walks into their own home after too many years away, slowly, but with a purpose that won't bend. Odessa Bell Jenkins was in her 70s, her skin weathered by sun and time, her hands steady from decades of labor and quiet waiting. She wore a faded blue dress and a straw hat, and slung over one shoulder was a canvas sack, worn soft at the seams, stitched with her initials, OBJ. Nobody noticed her at first. She didn't look like a woman with power. And that was the point. Most revolutions don't start with shouting. They start when someone who's been silent too long decides to speak. When she told the teller she wanted access to her office, they laughed. "Ma'am," someone said gently, "you must be in the wrong building." But she wasn't. She knew exactly where she was. Because years ago, her grandfather had helped build that bank, brick by brick, deal by deal, and when he died, he passed down not just stories, but papers, real ones, the kind that speak louder than memories, deeds, letters, a ledger that held more truth than the walls around her. In a world that's learned to ignore certain voices, Odessa didn't shout, she simply opened her sack. And here's the quiet lesson she brought with her: you don't need a microphone to make history echo. Sometimes, all you need is proof, and the courage to carry it. That day, she didn't just reclaim a room, she reminded everyone inside it that truth has weight. And when it finally lands, it doesn't knock, it settles in. But what Odessa carried wasn't just paperwork. It was pain, and patience, and the invisible burden of being forgotten. And when she unzipped that old canvas sack, she didn't just change the room, she changed the air. Because what came out of that bag next? Well, that's where the real story begins. It started with a chuckle, small, almost polite, one of those sounds people make when they think someone's confused or just out of place. Then another laugh followed, a cough, and the subtle shuffle of amusement spreading across the lobby like a ripple in still water. The idea that this elderly woman, with her straw hat and canvas sack, had an office in the top floor of a corporate bank. Absurd. At least, that's what they thought. They saw her clothes, her age, the way she moved without urgency, and they assumed she was lost, or lonely, or maybe a little senile. That kind of dismissal isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides in politeness, in soft patronizing tones, in smiles that say more than words. But then she opened the sack, and the laughter stopped. What came out wasn't just paperwork, it was evidence. Legal documents, photos from decades ago, letters with signatures long buried, a signed agreement from the bank's original founder, a stack of share certificates, Even a photograph of her grandfather shaking hands with a man in front of that very building. It was a timeline no one in the room had ever been taught, but it was real. Undeniably real. And in that moment, the room shifted. Here's the truth no one likes to admit. People often listen based on how you look. Not what you say. But Odessa brought something more powerful than appearance. She brought proof. And proof, unlike people, doesn't care how old you are or what you're wearing. The lesson: dignity doesn't always walk in wearing a suit. Sometimes it shows up in orthopedic shoes, carrying a sack stitched with initials and filled with receipts history tried to forget. That day, Odessa didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence that followed her papers said everything. And as the whispers began, and phones started ringing behind closed doors, one question hung in the air. What else had been buried beneath the paperwork? That's what they were about to find out. Inside that worn canvas sack wasn't just paperwork, it was a lifetime of quiet resistance. Piece by piece, Odessa began laying the documents on the long conference room table like a sacred ritual. She wasn't rushing, she wasn't performing. Every page, every folded letter, every embossed certificate told a part of the story she'd been stitching together for most of her adult life. There were original land deeds with her grandfather's name, handwritten letters from bank founders, stock certificates with embossed seals that shimmered slightly under the fluorescent lights. Some pages were brittle with age. Others still smelled faintly of the attic boxes they'd been pulled from. There was even a ledger, a black, leather-bound book filled with names, numbers, and notes, each one written in a tidy hand. It was the kind of book that didn't just track money, it tracked silence. Erased names, and stolen credit. For years, Odessa had traveled between county offices, city archives, and dusty church basements, chasing fragments of truth. Some papers she found in her uncle's garage, buried under old Christmas decorations. Others were mailed to her by distant cousins who'd found old stuff in forgotten closets. Each scrap mattered, because memory fades, but paper, if protected, endures. You see, when systems want to forget you, they hope you won't write things down. They hope you'll stop keeping records. But Odessa never stopped, not after her grandfather died. Not after her mother cried reading annual reports that no longer bore the Jenkins name. Not even after people told her to let it go. Here's the lesson she lived by: memory may be questioned. Paper, rarely. That's why, when she placed that final affidavit on the table, a notarized letter from the bank's co-founder acknowledging her grandfather as an equal partner, the room fell completely still. Because that day, Odessa didn't just bring papers. She brought proof that memory, when written down and carried long enough, can shake the walls of power. And yet, this wasn't even the most powerful item in her sack. That came next, and it would change everything they thought they knew. Before there was a building with glass walls and chrome fixtures, before the bank had a name printed on shiny credit cards and glossy brochures, there were two men, Ernest Hamilton and Elijah Jenkins. One white, one black, business partners, visionaries, and for a while, equals. Elijah Jenkins wasn't just a name on a deed. He was the one who handled the land acquisition, met with early investors, and convinced families in the neighborhood to open accounts when the bank was just a single desk and a safe in the back. He didn't dress fancy, didn't talk loud, but when he spoke, people listened. Because Elijah had something rarer than charisma, he had integrity. And he believed in building something that would last beyond him. In the early days, Jenkins and Hamilton worked side by side. There's even a black and white photograph. Odessa placed it gently on the table, of the two men shaking hands in front of the newly completed building. But over time, as the bank grew, so did the pressure to professionalize. And in that era, professional often meant white. Slowly, Elijah's name began to vanish from brochures, meeting minutes, stockholder reports. First, they called it streamlining, then consolidation, and finally, they just stopped mentioning him at all. No scandal, no announcement, just silence. The kind of silence that gets filed away in drawers and buried under new logos. It wasn't just erasure, it was rewriting. You see, legacy isn't always lost in one big moment. Sometimes it's chipped away, report by report, nameplate by nameplate, until the story looks cleaner, more convenient. But Odessa remembered. She remembered the stories her grandfather told, about staying up late to balance the books, or how he once walked miles in the rain to secure a loan for a farmer who'd been turned away elsewhere. She remembered his quiet pride and his deep belief that hard work would speak for itself. Only, it didn't, not in a world where the loudest stories are written by those who keep the pen. That's why what came next mattered so much. Because buried deep in that canvas sack was Elijah's final voice, the ledger that spoke when no one else would. It didn't look like much, just a small, black leather-bound book, edges worn soft with age. The kind of thing you might find tucked behind old tax folders in a dusty filing cabinet. But when Odessa placed it on the conference table and flipped it open, the room stopped breathing. This was no ordinary notebook. It was Elijah Jenkins's personal ledger, his own handwritten account of the bank's earliest days. Every loan approved, every dividend received, every transfer of shares, names, numbers, dates, initials, documented with a care that only comes from someone who knows they might one day need to prove the truth. Page after page revealed something that no one in that room wanted to believe: shares that had been reallocated without consent, dividend payouts that skipped his name, proxy votes signed by people who didn't exist. It wasn't just messy, it was methodical, a quiet rewriting of ownership, done in small strokes, under the radar, until there was nothing left with the name Jenkins on it. One of the attorneys, a young woman named Selena, whispered as she flipped through the pages, "These aren't just notes. This is a trail." And she was right, a paper trail that showed exactly how a man could be erased, not because he failed, but because someone else decided he didn't belong. Here's the quiet tragedy: if Odessa hadn't held onto that ledger, none of it would have mattered. History would have stayed edited, clean, comfortable, and wrong. The lesson: if you're not writing your story down, someone else might be writing it for you. That little black book was Elijah's voice, resurrected through ink and time. And it had waited long enough. But as Odessa sat back, letting the attorneys speak in hurried tones and make urgent phone calls, she knew something else was coming, something she had always suspected. Because when the truth finally cracks open the door, people start asking, how deep does this go? And that's exactly what they were about to find out. By the time the regional legal team arrived, the energy inside the bank had shifted. What started as disbelief had turned into discomfort. Phone lines were lit up. Department heads whispered behind closed doors. And upstairs, in that quiet conference room, the air felt heavier, not from heat, but from the weight of something undeniable. The attorneys moved quickly, flipping through Odessa's documents, scanning dates, checking seals, comparing signatures. They weren't laughing, they weren't questioning, they were bracing. Because systems, especially ones built over decades, don't expect to be challenged by someone carrying a sack. They expect lawyers in suits, news headlines, lawsuits, not a woman in orthopedic shoes with her grandfather's handwriting. But here it was: proof of financial misrepresentation, erased ownership, and decades of silence papered over with corporate polish. Joseph Lyles, the assistant manager who had smirked earlier, now sat silently with a pen in his hand and shame in his eyes. He wasn't alone. All around the bank, people began moving differently. Staff who had barely looked at Odessa that morning were now whispering in hallways, wondering how much of what they thought they knew was incomplete, or simply false. And here's the truth that's hard for any institution to admit: most cracks in the system don't come from explosions. They come from steady pressure. From one person refusing to let go. From records that don't match the story. From a truth that's too detailed to ignore. Odessa didn't storm in, she didn't shout, but what she brought exposed more than a single act of wrongdoing. It revealed a pattern. One that no PR statement could cover. One that might require accountability no one had planned for. That day, the system didn't fall apart, but it flinched. And as calls went out to headquarters, and teams began pulling old records from locked vaults, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about one bank. This was about every place that ever chose convenience over truth. And as the storm gathered beyond those walls, Odessa remained still, because the next part wasn't hers alone. It was the system's turn to speak. When the attorneys finally paused their questions, when the conference room quieted long enough for Odessa to speak, someone asked the thing they'd all been circling around. What is it you want from all this? It was a fair question. After all, most people who uncover buried truths do it for one reason: compensation. A lawsuit, a settlement, a check with more zeros than apologies. But Odessa just looked up, her voice soft but steady. "I'm not here for money," she said. "I'm here for my grandfather's name." You could feel the room inhale. Because what Odessa came for couldn't be calculated. It didn't live in dollar signs or court rulings. What she wanted was recognition, restoration, a place in the story that her family helped write but had been cut from without consent. Her grandfather didn't build that bank to get rich. He built it to serve. And to be erased from the institution he co-founded, that was a theft no spreadsheet could tally. She remembered her mother crying the day they removed the Jenkins name from the foundation plaque. She remembered walking past that building as a teenager, knowing her family had helped lay its bricks, yet hearing nothing about it in schoolbooks or speeches. What she carried wasn't just documentation, it was generational grief. Silent, patient, waiting. Here's the lesson. Not all justice is about compensation. Some justice is about memory. About saying, "We were here," and having the world finally say back, "We remember." Odessa didn't want power. She didn't want control. She wanted the plaque corrected, the records amended, the truth spoken aloud. And if the system didn't do it willingly, she was ready to let the courts do it for her. But what happened next proved something even more unexpected. That when truth is undeniable, sometimes even power learns how to listen. As the legal team continued to sift through the documents, Odessa remained quiet, watching the chaos unfold around her. The room was filled with frantic whispers and urgent calls. But Odessa didn't add to the noise. She simply sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady and calm. The silence she carried wasn't passive, it was purposeful. You see, silence is powerful, but it's not just about the absence of words. Silence can be a shield, a tool, or even a weapon. When people are determined to ignore something, silence allows them to do so. It lets them erase names, rewrite history, and hide truths. But when someone chooses not to speak out of fear, it gives the system room to keep going. Unchanged, the system grows stronger in its silence, as if everything is fine, as if no one is watching. But silence, when chosen by someone with purpose, has the ability to stop a room full of people in their tracks. And that's exactly what Odessa did. She didn't need to fill the air with words or anger. She simply let the silence speak for itself. Because, in truth, the most powerful stories often don't need to be shouted. They just need to be heard. This is a lesson many learn too late. Silence can either protect you, or it can allow others to control the narrative. In Odessa's case, her silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. Her quiet insistence on truth forced the system to acknowledge what it had ignored for so long. And now, there was no hiding, not from her, and not from the people who had long assumed their version of history was the only one that mattered. As the hours passed, the bank's power structures began to crack, not with a crash, but with the slow unraveling of something much deeper. The system had been so sure it could suppress history. But history has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it. And with each document Odessa presented, it became clearer. The silence was about to end. Weeks later, a small ceremony was held at the bank. The lobby had been polished, flowers arranged, a modest podium placed near the entrance. And behind it, mounted on freshly painted wood, was a brand new brass nameplate, Jenkins and Hamilton, founders. Odessa stood in front of it in a navy blue suit, her straw hat casting a soft shadow across her face. She didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't wave like a politician. Instead, She stepped forward, ran her fingers across her grandfather's name, and whispered, "You're home now." It was a powerful moment, quiet, like everything she did, but full of weight. But here's the question that lingered for many. Does a new nameplate fix what was erased? The answer is both yes and no. Symbolism matters. A corrected plaque tells a new generation that someone cared enough to set the record straight. It plants truth in public view, where silence once lived. But memory, real memory, doesn't just live in brass or marble. It lives in the stories we tell, the books we write, the lessons we pass on. A nameplate is a beginning, not an ending. And that's what Odessa understood so well. She didn't come for applause. She didn't need a ribbon cutting. What she wanted, what she fought for, was for her family's name to stop being a footnote and start being part of the story. Because when you restore someone's place in history, you're not just honoring the past, you're correcting the lens through which we see the future. The lesson: recognition without remembrance is decoration, but recognition with remembrance is restoration. As people began to leave, reporters still snapping photos, Odessa stepped aside. A young teller approached. Daniel, the same one who had laughed on the first day. This time, he spoke softly. "You changed how I see this place." "Thank you." Odessa nodded. "Then change how you treat the next person who walks in with something to say." And with that, she turned and walked out. But outside those doors, something had already begun, because truth, once seen, doesn't just disappear. After the ceremony, Odessa returned home, not to a mansion or spotlight, but to a modest house on the edge of town. She made herself a cup of coffee, sat in her favorite chair by the window, and placed the now folded canvas sack on the table beside her. The bag was lighter now, but not because it was empty. It was lighter because what it had carried had finally been seen. Beside it sat a small package, delivered that morning. Inside was the old nameplate from the bank, the one that had once erased her family's name. A note was tucked inside. "This belonged to you all along." And for the first time in a long time, Odessa breathed easy. Her story isn't the only one. All across the country, there are families with faded deeds in drawers, forgotten photos in boxes, and stories that no one bothered to ask about. Stories that matter, stories that deserve to be heard. Because what happened to the Jenkins family wasn't just a clerical oversight, it was part of a pattern. A pattern of rewriting history to fit a more comfortable version of truth. But here's the hope. When even one person dares to pull the thread, the whole fabric can shift. The lesson: if you're sitting on a truth the world forgot, don't let it die in silence. Protect it, share it, pass it down, because what's buried doesn't always stay gone. Not if someone's willing to dig with care and speak with courage. Odessa didn't set out to lead a movement, but her story lit a spark. Other families began asking questions. Old archives were reopened. A generation that once assumed their history was gone forever began to wonder, what if it's still here? Just waiting to be claimed. So if you're listening to this, and you have a story buried under dust and doubt, this moment is yours too. Because sometimes, the quietest voice in the room is the one that rewrites everything.